Hello everybody, welcome to part 3 of the How to Play Basic Impetus. Glad you can join me. I hope you learned something from this next episode. Today, in this part, I'm going to talk about groups. Go into groups, how they're formed, and how they work in the game. I'd also like to cover disorder a little bit more. I've mentioned it in the previous parts, but I think we'll get into a little more detail about how it works. And hopefully I'll be touching on a few things regarding movement, but it is quite a big section of the rules, so it's probably going to take up some further parts. Like in part 4, I might cover more details on movement. But for now, look forward to learning about groups and disorder. Now is probably a good time to talk about disorder before we get into the actual nuts and bolts of the rules of Basic Impetus. What is it, and how does a unit get it, disorder? Well, ideally, units want to maintain a tight formation. They want their officers in control. They want their spears and shields facing the enemy. But unfortunately, in ancient and medieval battles, that can be lost, and we call that disorder. And we use little disorder markers to indicate that on units during the battle. As you can see in front of you, I use little red rubies. These two units are both disordered. These two aren't. Now, what are the sources of disorder? Well, there's basically two main sources of disorder in the game. One is from combat, being engaged in close combat, being shot at. That can cause a loss of order in the ranks. The second source of disorder is from movement, like when a unit attempts, say, a fancy move like a shift sideways or moving backwards. Another source from movement would be moving through very difficult terrain, like through a plowed field or through thick forests. Things of that nature could cause a loss of order in a unit. And as we go down in this series and learn more about the details of combat, and movement, I will go more detail about disorder when it occurs. One important thing to keep in mind, however, about disorder is that it's not a stackable condition. It either applies to a unit or it doesn't. So you won't see a situation where a unit has to be marked with, say, 3 disorder markers or 4. That wouldn't happen. It either applies or it doesn't. One or the other. So that's disorder at its basis. One concept in Impetus is the concept of forming units into groups, allowing them to move on the tabletop together as one cohesive whole. In front of you I have a bunch of units that are all formed up into separate little groups. The rules define how units need to be positioned to form a legal group. In this case, I have a group of units in a line. This here, I have a group of units formed in column. Back here, we have a line. And back here, I have a unit of heavy cav formed up in column. The important things to remember is that foot troops can only form into groups with other foot troops, as we have here. Mounted troops can only form up with other mounted troops, as we have back here. So you can't have a mix of infantry and cavalry forming a group. Another thing to note is that skirmishers, this unit right here, can form a group with foot or mounted troops. So in this case here we have 3 units of foot, the central one being skirmishers. That's all fine and dandy. That's okay. Now here we have a column. 2 units. We have some heavy knights, heavy cav, and they're preceded by a unit of skirmish foot. Now that's the only time that you can mix troop types, foot with cav, is if they're skirmishers. Now there are some situations units could be in where they cannot form up into a group. And one of those instances is if they're disordered. A disordered unit cannot be part of a group. Other exceptions would be artillery units, Wagenburg, war wagons, and scythe chariots. They do not form up with other units into groups. So keep that in mind. And basically the rules cover how and what qualifies as a group, but it defines basically 2 types. There's columns, like we have here, a column of units, and then there's lines, a line of units. And basically, to count as a line, for instance, all the units have to be in side base edge contact, like these, and have a continuous straight front line going on here. In other words, their front corners have to be lined up. And this would be a legal line of units. For the column, it's basically that, again, all the corners have to be touching. The second unit would have to have its front corners touching the back corners of the unit in front of it. And the same would apply for the unit behind them. That constitutes and defines a group, in this case a column and a line. And all these examples in front of you show legal groups. And over here we have 4 units that are in a group. We have this unit of light infantry, and this unit of skirmishers, and the 4th unit of heavy foot in the back of this unit. Here's your continuous front line. Here is your column. Now, the rules allow you to have columns and lines together within the group. So in this case, this is a legal group. You got the 3 units in line, and this unit in a column. That is a legal group and can move together. Back here, we have a unit of cav, heavy cav, and in front of it, in column, is a unit of skirmishers. Now that's a legal group. And if you remember, skirmishers are able to form with either mounted or infantry in a group. Now here's some examples of non-groups. First of all, in front of us, we have 3 units of foot. The problem with this formation is that none of them are part of the group, and the reason is because, number one, there's no frontal straight line going on here. All the corners are staggered, and they're obviously not in a column. So each of these units could not form a group. They'd have to move and activate individually. Behind them, we have a column of 3 units. You have the skirmishers, the heavy foot, and light infantry. Unfortunately, only these 2 front units can move as a group, as a column, because their corners are touching and you got that straight line on the side going. This 3rd unit in the back is staggered. It's not part of this group and therefore has to activate and move separately. So that's not a group. And behind them, we've got a mix of heavy foot, cavalry, and skirmishers. None of these guys can move as a group. Skirmishers can with foot or cavalry mounted troops, as long as they follow the normal rules for forming a group. In this case, they're not in front line contact with this cavalry unit, so they are not part of this unit to form a group. Over here, you've got a heavy foot and a cav. They can't form a group together, so there's individual activation and movement going on here too. No group. And finally, over here, we do have 1, 2, 3, 4 units. This unit is not part of a group and will have to activate and move separately because it's not part of that straight line going on here, and it's not in a column either. So that's not part of the group. These 2 units, we've got some light foot, some heavy foot. They are in column. They are in a legal group. They can move together as a group. Over here we've got skirmishers who can also be part of this group. They're in the front line contact, and they would qualify as part of the group. However, they are marked as disordered, which means they can't be part of the group. So there's some examples of non-groups. It's important to note that forming and moving your units as a group is completely optional. I mean, just because you have your guys formed up in a legal group doesn't mean they have to move and function as a group if you don't want to. They can still activate and do different things if you so choose as units. But the decision as to move them as a group, form them into groups, and use them as a group is totally up to you, and its advantages are actually quite subtle in the game, as you will see as you start to play your battles. The main effect is that it can have a big impact on close combat if you move a group of units together into contact with the enemy, and we'll get into that when we get in the close combat section. It also helps by moving them together for units to support each other, again, in close combat. So it is useful for those purposes, and we'll get into that later. Another important thing to keep in mind is that as units move together as a group, it can happen that 1 or more units might actually become disordered as they move. For instance, moving through certain types of terrain which disorders them. When that occurs and the unit becomes disordered, it is considered no longer part of that group and would cease its movement and be disordered. For instance, in this case down here, those 3 units were originally in a group, and they were moving together. But as soon as this unit moved into this difficult terrain, it became disordered and was no longer considered part of this group. So these 2 would continue their movement as a group. And if there was any other units that were part of this group because of this unit, say if they were on this side of them or behind him in a column, they also would stop and cease their movement because this guy is disordered. Kind of like a broken link in a chain. So their movement would also stop. So that's the effect of disorder on a group. Okay, folks, I hope you enjoyed that. That brings part 3 to a close. I hope you learned a little bit more about basic impetus and how groups work and how they're formed and how disorder affects units in a game. Next part 4, I hope to get more in detail with the actual rules for moving units, including wheels, moving to the rear, sideways, shifting, charging into contact, all that good stuff. And eventually the terrain and all that. So stay tuned for the next part 4. That should be coming pretty soon. Okay, folks, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed. And any questions, please ask me. I'll be glad to help you if you have any questions with basic impetus or impetus in general. Okay, folks, thank you very much for watching. Until next time, bye-bye.